Thank you for the opportunity to discuss public lighting with you today. It's actually a subject that I've actually been interested in ever since I joined the SEC back in about 1980. My roles have been in basically electrical distribution, mainly rural based, as my work has been rural, but in larger regional centres as well. Mainly dealing with poles and wires, an occasional inquiry from councils about public lighting, and also Vic roads, and then more so in recent years dealing with residential subdivisions and infrastructure projects where you've got public lighting going in with major upgrades and road duplications and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't profess to be a public lighting expert, and but I'll do my best to not waste your time today. Public lighting legislation and acts are, or public lighting design is impacted by many different acts and bylaws and rules and regulations. So that there is just AS 1158 related to public lighting. So there's a lot of information there to digest when you're trying to do a public lighting design, and I'm going to try and condense that down into 45 minutes. There's all the actual Australian standards related to that, and of which that's just one of, well, actually several of those. The 1158s you see there, they're all public lighting, and there's some probably some New Zealand ones in there as well. Principles of lighting design. You probably hear some of these terms used throughout. I tend to fall back on light levels, light intensities and things, rather than go into these, because it's just too much to try and digest all these different things, and it just becomes confusing. But we'll start off with average carriageway luminance. You'll see that, the symbol L, and that will be basically lux. Average luminance, which is an E. Then you've got glare, illuminance, longitudinal luminance uniformity, once again luminance on its own, as in individual luminance at a point, luminous flux, total lantern output in any direction in lumens, and then there's luminous intensity, which is luminous flux in a specific direction. Unit is candela. You've got maintenance factors. That's allowing for light depreciation over time. When a light, it's LED lights, now that LED lights have been introduced, maintenance factors technically could be reduced, given that the LED basically, the way it's designed, it will maintain a consistent output throughout its life, whereas the older discharge lanterns and fluoros, etc., depreciated over time, and this maintenance factor, which is typically set at 0.7, that's applied when you're doing the design, so it actually pulls the light levels back in your calculations, so that at the end of the lantern's life cycle, or if it gets polluted, if it's in a high traffic area, you've got trucks and diesel fumes and particulate, etc., accumulating on the lens, or it's filling up with bugs sitting inside the diffuser. This will allow for depreciation of light, and technically that lighting is still compliant at the end of that lantern's life, except for when obviously the lantern fails. And then you've got overall luminance uniformity, and which is fairly important to maintain a consistent light level as you're driving down a road. You don't want to be going from light to dark, light to dark, light to dark, because your eyes are going to struggle to adjust to that. Overall uniformity is basically providing a relatively even, consistent light as you're travelling. so that your eyes aren't working overtime trying to adjust. Street lighting is primarily concerned about safety and showing the run of the road and revealing any obstructions and other hazards to the road user. The ability to see fine details and distinguish colours is not needed. Visibility is provided by brightness contrast. In AS NZ 1158, the light technical parameters for a major road are luminance-based, physical quantity corresponding to the brightness of the surface, and a luminance-based quantity of light falling on a surface for minor roads. And then you've got glare, which is discomfort or impairment of vision when lanterns are excessively bright in the field of view in relation to the surroundings. Modern lanterns have improved glare control, and particularly with LED lanterns, now that they are actually recessing the LEDs up into the actual housing of the lantern, and you tend to see less glare issues because of that design of the LED lanterns. But having said that, LEDs have been known to be causing glare issues in certain areas, and I am aware where they've actually had to replace lanterns on a major road, replace LED lanterns with a different type because there were still glare issues. And you can reduce the glare by increasing the mounting heights, with fewer lanterns. You can spread them out a little bit further depending on the lantern itself, and you can also use aeroscreen lanterns which further recess the actual light emitting portion of the lantern further into the housing so that there is a more distinct cut-off of the light emanating from the actual lantern itself. That little diagram there, the little person in their car and the lantern up mounted high. You can see by sort of the angles, and you've got the roof of the car, person driving along. You can imagine that the higher that lantern is, the less likelihood that that glare from that particular lantern is going to go directly into the person's eyes. Category P lighting relates to roads and other public areas on which visual requirements of pedestrians are dominant. Local roads, pathways, parks, car parks, shopping areas, lighting requirements apply to the whole of the road reserve for Category P. Category V lighting is applicable to the roads where the visual requirements of the motorist are dominant, and it basically covers the actual carriageways in a dual carriageway. It'll be the lighting of that carriageway on this side, the carriageway on this side, and will also include sections of the road verge or the nature strip in the lead up on the approach to the carriageways. So there's a different design requirement for the two. There's a bit of theory. I won't go into the calculations here, but it's really just those formulas and the terminology relates to that diagram as to how the light actually travels, the various paths the light travels, and the calculations required for the light to actually leave the light source. It actually can go directly to the observer as you approach the lantern, but can also reflect off the actual road surface itself. So lighting design is actually taking into account the reflective nature of the road surface. I often wonder about brand new hot mix roads where the bitumen is very black and how this actually applies, but they assure me that in a very short space of time the rocks, etc., the aggregate in that bitumen will actually be exposed, and it's the actual reflection of those rocks, and the more cars go over, the rocks get shinier and the reflection actually increases as the road wears. So your lighting in it will actually improve as that road wears. Residential streets are typically lit to Category P4, which is your URD estates, or P5, which is existing overhead reticulation areas. So your old poles and wires areas, the P5 applies, and it's typically, P5 is typically allowing for a light on probably every second pole, which typically puts them around 90 metres apart. There are certain areas, and there are images in this presentation where you've actually got P5 areas where there's lanterns on every pole, and it probably exceeds category P4 because of the type of lanterns used and the mounting heights. There are 10 other category P standards for public areas, and which are pathways, footpaths, arterial roads, car parks, walkways, public lighting, public activity areas, town squares, transport terminals, shopping areas, steps and stairways, subways, footbridges, outdoor car parks, circulation roadways and parking spaces. I'll only really be focusing on P4, and I might just jump over to P5 during this presentation just for discussion. So councils will normally specify that a category P4 code lighting is required in a new residential development. Having said that, councils also have the ability to vary that. There are certain situations or certain developments where category P4 potentially not really relevant or is overzealous. Typical example is your 2,000 square metre lot type developments, where potentially you would have a streetlight pole in front of every block on one side of the road to actually meet P4 code. There are opportunities, and I'll discuss that a little bit further down the track, as to different ways of designing to still achieve code, but you need to use different light fittings and different poles. Code lighting can be used or can be designed using spacing tables or using lighting software. I'll touch on both of those during this presentation. Spacing tables can be used for curved roads provided spacings do not exceed the straight section spacing and line of sight between the lanterns remains within the road reserve. The supply authorities typically will only approve Type 4 luminaires. Type 4 luminaires are basically designed so that the light output, you'll have perhaps a third of the light coming out the rear of the lantern, a majority of the light, probably a small amount coming out to the rear, given that it's going to be sitting next to the road and it needs to light up the footpath behind it. But it also spreads most of its light along the road so that the lantern is put perpendicular on a bracket perpendicular to the road, and the light will spread out along the road and extend to the other side of the road. And in the case of Type 4 luminaires, they do have effective glare control, and they also have effective upward waste light, like very low upward waste light. So lighting designers need to choose luminaires and poles from approved materials lists, which are available from the network distributor. You may find that PowerCore, particularly, I'm sort of mainly PowerCore centric in this presentation because that's where I do a majority of my work. But recently they relaxed their requirements to get access to their standards. So if you have a need, you can actually get onto their website and apply for access. They will give you a user ID and a password that will allow you to access their technical standards, of which public lighting is in there. There's probably about 30 or 40 different standards that they have related to public lighting, but they will also give you access to their permitted materials lists. So if you're looking at a plan that's been submitted by a contractor, one of the things that you probably need to be checking is whether or not they are using lanterns that are approved by the distributor, or in the case of Vic Roads, approved by Vic Roads. This here is the category P lanterns for use in housing estates. You'll see that there is actually, they call it a standard and a semi-cut-off. There are two manufacturers who supply approved lanterns for that purpose. Similarly to the other, you've got an Aero and then a high output semi-cut-off and a high output aero. So there are a number of manufacturers that are approved to be for their lamps to be used in category P areas in power core. Similarly, Luminaire and Bosnet, United Energy will have similar standards. They all basically originated from the SEC before all these DBs were created through privatisation. Upward waste light, which is light emitted above the horizontal plane, must not exceed a set ratio, which is for type 4, the maximum allowable is 12%. You'll see in some of the calculation examples that I've provided that LED lanterns are way below that. Light spill into adjacent residential properties shall not exceed 1 lux. The maintenance factor, as I discussed before, typically 0.7. Compliance to meet or exceed values of average horizontal illuminance and horizontal illuminance and be lower than the horizontal illuminance uniformity factor, which are just basically these items down here. That's basically out of the standard, and it's basically setting the parameters for the P4 lighting design. The important ones here are 0.85 and 0.14 lux. That's the absolute minimum amount of lux that you need in any part of that road reserve. And uniformity factor basically is a ratio of the minimum amount of light at any point in that road reserve compared to the maximum amount of light in that road reserve. So it's going back to that more uniform light distribution. You will still find in category P areas there is a significant difference between the brightest part and the dullest part, but provided it's within that ratio of 10, it's still acceptable. These diagrams here, basically for pole and luminaire placement. These are in category P residential areas, and you must have a lantern in this area at an intersection, and then you've got spacing, which is basically available from spacing tables for a particular lantern and a particular mounting height. There is a requirement to maintain this spacing, but you always must have a lantern within this hatched area. Similarly across the other side there, and also in court bowls, the Australian standard, that top one on the far right there, that is actually the preferred one in the Australian standard. What I did notice when I was looking at the Australian standard, that they want 0.75s as that spacing between the lantern in the actual court itself and then the one in the bowl. The reason being is that the lantern in the court bowl has light distributing out to perhaps to the top and the bottom of that court bowl, and not particularly much coming towards that other lantern. So that is actually an error that I did notice when I was going through the standards, just checking on, doing a bit of fact check on information I was pulling out of the power core standards. Yeah, so that's basically just some indication of where lanterns need to be placed. So if you're looking at a plan, keeping this in mind, just be checking that it actually meets these, you have lanterns in these locations. And then on curved roads, as mentioned before, there is line of sight. You can maintain normal lantern spacing provided you've got direct line of sight within the road reserve between each of the lanterns. If you don't have line of sight, you either need to close up your spacings or perhaps shift a light to the other side of the road so you then establish line of sight. And on the other one there, you've got a road with category V lighting, which is typically your arterial type road. And then if you've got no traffic control devices, as in medians or splitter islands or anything, the requirement is just half the spacing, half the normal spacing, to to have a lantern either side of that sort of significant intersection. As I was just talking about, we've got category V road lighting on that through road with a central median, and you've also got splitter islands on the road either side. You then need, when you've got splitter islands, you then need to have a category V lantern located on the approach to those splitter islands. It's just a standard so that those splitter islands are actually lit adequately, because otherwise they potentially could be lost in the almost silhouetted against the lighting along that main road. So you've got spacing tables for various standard luminaires. LED is now the standard for most supply authorities. Standard output LED luminaires typically range from 17 to 23 watt total power. High output LEDs, which for use in category P areas, 30 to 37 watt total power. Of note, and it does affect the lighting design, decorative poles typically don't have an upcast angle, and that will actually affect the light distribution from that fitting, and particularly affect the penetration of that light to the other side of the road. And 5.5 metre mount height has become the standard for residential subdivisions, but standard poles are also available to give a mounting height of 7.5 and 9 metre mount height. Approved decorative poles will typically only give you the option of either a 5.5 or an 8.5 metre mount height. And the mount height basically is distance from the ground level to the actual fitting itself. And in the case of upcast angle, is the angle at that bracket at the top of that pole. In the case of a standard pole, which people describe as a hockey stick pole, it will have a natural 5-degree upcast angle to assist with lighting of the actual roadway. So there's a typical spacing table for a 5.5 metre mount height with various road widths. And in this case, the road width is the full road width from basically building line to building line. It's not really considered, it doesn't consider the actual road width itself. It is basically category P, once, as I said before, is related to pedestrian activity, not so much road. The road users have headlights, they can generally see where they're going. It's more for pedestrians to be moving around in that area, and also for them to be seen. If they do happen to step on a road, there still is the opportunity for a motorist to actually see them, potentially before they step in front of the headlights, basically. So you've got various lantern types up the top there, and for you can see there the LED has a 51 metre lantern spacing. That image there is probably, it would not be considered a compliant lighting design as far as a category P is concerned. I'm pretty sure that's an image from, I just grabbed off the internet, it's probably Europe somewhere. This particular image here is actually in Victoria. I think that might be down at Horsham. In assessment of lanterns, lanterns are supplied for use and approved by the supply authorities with a photometric data file, which basically the lanterns are tested in the laboratory, and they will actually move that lantern through every conceivable orientation possible while it's operating, and then measure the light output as it's moving through all the planes in every direction. And then they'll come up with a photometric data file, which then allows computer calculation of the light output from that luminaire, and then you apply the reflectance factors of the road, the mounting height, and influence of other lanterns beside each other, because they all consecutive lanterns will actually impact, there'll be overlap of light, so you'll actually get the summation of the light from the two sources in between the two, which will then create this sort of corridor of light along the street. In this case here, got 7.5 metre mount height. In the case of the LED, it's actually dropped from 51 back to 49 for a 20 metre wide road. But you can see there, it's actually quite significant spacing on narrower roads. On the right here, this is actually from PLE PCAT, which is a program that comes with Perfect Light software. In this case here, I've put in the photometric data for a PLED2 Sylvania lantern. It has 1968 lumen output. It's a 17 watt total output. We've applied a maintenance factor of 0.7. It has a 5-degree upcast angle, given that it's on a standard pole. And it's single-sided lighting, and it's also set for the lantern physically being 1/4 of the distance across the actual road reserve itself. And in this case, the upward waste light ratio of that particular lantern is 1.4%. We've got a spacing table there equivalent to the one. This is the spacing table that PowerPool will provide. That's the one which actually comes out specific for that particular lantern. And for a 20 metre road at 7.5 metres, we're now up to 54.7 metre spacing. This here is an extract of it shows lighting contours in the residential area. You've got a 16 metre wide road. Doesn't particularly show up that well, but this yellow contour is actually the 1 lux contour, which you want to try and keep that within the road reserve, as I mentioned before. It does sneak into the frontage here on occasions, but that's perfectly fine. It's really not 1 lux shining in someone's front bedroom window. You've also got this 0.14 contour around the outside. So that 0.14 technically should be within this road reserve. In this case here it's slightly out, but that is actually a drainage basin here. So yeah, there's a little bit of give and take. In some cases you have to minor compromises to make the spacing work. You don't want to put an extra lantern in just to fill that small little gap in there, and you'll actually find when this area develops and you get houses and fences and both vertical and horizontal surfaces which reflect the light, you'll actually find that will fill in itself anyway. And in this case here, 17 watt LED, 5.5 mount height, 16 metre wide road and 47 metre typical lantern spacing. Not always the case at intersections. You've got the requirement there of the lantern within that 10 metre zone of the intersection, and then other than that, it's a matter of massaging the position of lanterns to try and get that 0.14 lux on the outside fairly uniform, and basically filling in the entire road reserve. So you've got semi-cut-off lanterns, which is this particular type here. That's an LED light fitting, but it has this plastic or Perspex diffuser. That diffuser is designed to actually refract the light as it passes through that, so it spreads it out further. So another thing to consider when evaluating a lighting plan is if you have traffic control devices, which councils will obviously often specify, particularly on longer straight sections of road or major through roads where there is an issue or potentially an issue with people driving too fast. When you do put a traffic control device in and it's of a type that if you hit it at speed you're potentially going to lose control, you need to have 3.5 lux over the actual traffic control device and at least 3.5 metres either side of that traffic control device at least 3.5 lux. You can have more, but on the approaches on both sides of the road, you typically need 3.5 lux light at least. And to achieve that, typically you'll get a situation where you'll have your normal 5.5 mount height lanterns through the rest of the development, but at the traffic control device, you'll typically see a taller pole, which is normally a 10.8 metre pole, which is set 1.6 in the ground and a mount height of 9 metres, or in the case of a decorative pole situation, you'll typically get the 8.5 metre mount height. You need the lantern that high to avoid glare issues because of the high intensity of light coming out of that fitting. You do get glare issues if they're mounted too low. To a lesser extent with LEDs, but it's still potentially a glare issue. So yeah, higher mounting heights are generally required. In terms of for column placements, if you're evaluating your plan, you're looking at whereabouts the pole is in the nature strip. It needs to be typically 0.7 of a metre from the face of the pole. If you've got an uncurbed roadway, minimum 1 metre offset from the uncurbed roadway. Offset 1 metre from a driveway. Prefer at least 4 metres from a tree, given that the tree canopy is going to grow up and it will potentially restrict the light output. I've actually seen trees planted 2 metres away from a streetlight pole and the canopy's completely enveloped the tree, totally defeating the purpose of light being there in the first place. At least 5 metres from the side or side front joint boundary if a driveway position is not fixed. Many councils will actually insist that you actually put driveway crossovers in as part of the development, in which case PowerCo will then allow you to, or the supply authority will typically allow you to position a lantern closer to the boundary on the opposite side of the lot to where the driveway is. Yeah, rural areas typically will say, well, no, we want the lantern somewhere closer to the middle of the lot frontage to avoid issues with driveways or streetlight poles impacting the position where the purchaser wants to put their driveway. It's not cheap to shift a streetlight pole. Typically you're looking at, you're not going to get much change at about $5,000 to actually move a streetlight pole. And that's just in the Category P area. So you want to try and get these positioned from the outset so they're not going to be an obstruction to the allotment purchases. The poles must be clear of overhead power lines. If you've got a development coming off an overhead development area and there's street lights that need to go in underneath or potentially, pretty well, you occasionally get that situation. It's not common. Pole setback zones are actually covered in the next section. Poles must have at least 0.3 of a metre clearance to any other asset in the ground. So be mindful of that when you're looking at streetlight pole positions on a plan. Mindful of water, gas, drainage pipes. Do you actually have that, or will you achieve that 0.3 metre clearance? And that's from the face of the pole to the face of the pipe or face of the other asset. Typically supplied from the nearest connection pit and typically supplied via a 6mm cable in a lot of cases conduited outside the main trench. The objective of Category V lighting. Category V lighting is to provide lighted environment which is conducive to safe and comfortable movement of vehicular and pedestrian traffic at night and the discouragement of illegal acts. Category V lighting, the visual requirements of motorists predominate, although lighting provided for this purpose will generally serve to facilitate the other objectives outlined above. Category V lighting focuses on lighting levels on the carriageway and the road verges, as I discussed before, and also traffic control structures and curbs, splitter islands, median strips and roundabouts. Category V3 is most commonly specified for freeways and arterial roads. Category V5 is also appropriate for minor arterials and intersections where traffic volumes and pedestrian activity are lower, but still significant. For Category V, there is a requirement for computer design. If someone's submitting a lighting design that is V3 standard to code, they are expected to use computer calculation methods. There are certain design rules which apply, which are basically pulled from the standard. I'll cover those in a little while. But the main thing is V3 lighting, you're quite within your rights to request the designer provide evidence that he's gone through the lighting design process and provide computer outputs from that computer program. Contour planes generally come from the computer design. This is an extract of the Australian standard relating to Category V. We've got our V3 and V5 stated here. The main ones that we really get interested in is overall uniformity. Another one, Vic Roads. If you've got Vic Roads jobs coming through, Australian standard says threshold increment, which is actually, I'm not sure what the origin of the term threshold increment is, but it actually relates to the glare output of a lighting scheme. And Vic Roads have actually reduced that to 15% as of, I think, late last year. And probably the Australian standard will probably follow suit. I think it's an advent of the proliferation of LED lanterns in major traffic route lighting areas because the actual lantern itself appears to be so much more intense. The light output is so much more intense. Not so much more light, but it appears more intense because of the colour of it. It's a very white light. Basically, LED lanterns are putting out light which is basically the equivalent of sunlight. So when you get high output lanterns, you will actually get quite intense light from the actual source itself. And lanterns are actually constantly being redesigned to make them probably more compliant to this reduction in threshold increment for use on major roads, because as I said before, there's been situations where they've had to take LED lanterns down and replace them with alternate versions because of the glare factors that people were experiencing. Surround illuminance, 50%, which is that road verge, typically 2-3 metres off the carriageway. You need 50% of the light output. And then you've got for intersections on the right-hand side. Intersections, you've got point horizontal luminance of 7.5 lux, and then a horizontal uniformity factor of 8, which is that ratio of maximum versus minimum light output within that designated design area, and a maximum of 3% upward waste light. These are pole placement guidelines. Typically where you've got a converging road, there is a requirement to have that 7.5 lux in this area and 7.5 lux in that area. This is a design rule type scenario, the same thing, but you can just place a lantern there of that typically that you're using throughout the scheme. As long as you've got a lantern there and a lantern there, that technically complies, but you would generally do a computer calculation that verifies that you do in fact meet the light output requirements at those particular traffic zones. Similar thing there, but you only need on a converging road, it's only really required at the entrance where the lanes change and you actually have traffic changing direction that you need to light it up. And outside the road, you've got 50% of your light output, 50% with 3.75 lux if it's a category V3, or alternatively you just place a lantern there, as long as it's within, as long as you've got that light output within 5 metres of the actual converging point or diverging point. You also need to light up the end or the nose of splitter islands where you've got a lane, a roadway that's splitting into a divided carriageway. That's a zone there where you must achieve that typically V3 category 7.5 lux across this area, and at least half of that directly underneath, which is generally not an issue. But having said that, there are limitations as to where you can place lanterns in relation to that splitter island. And this here is your typical complex intersection design, where you've got your little islands in here, central median, and then median through here, plus potentially turn lanes. This area here basically all has to have minimum 7.5 lux throughout this entire hatched area. That's an illuminance-based design area, whereas the rest of this, which is unhatched, is your luminance-based design area and can be based on lantern spacings as determined through your lighting software and compliant to the Australian standards. Also in the column placement area, for traffic routes, you've got slip base and impact absorbent poles. This table will actually give an indication of the setback required, and you've got 3 separate zones there, where in the case of E, total exclusion, nothing within setback zone 1, and then setback zone 2, you've then got N for not recommended, or A for acceptable, or P for preferred, depending on impact, whether it's impact absorbent or slip base. So impact, IAC is impact absorbent, SBC is slip base. It's basically telling you where particular lanterns or particular poles can be placed. And in the case of concrete poles, generally you try and exclude them from these 3 zones, and the only place that you would actually contemplate a concrete pole is probably within zone 3. There are situations where you have to use concrete poles for dynamic clearance requirements. I'll just go into that a little bit shortly. Running out of time. These are the zones that you referred to in that previous table. 0.7 category P area typically, or roads not exceeding 80 kilometres an hour. Could be a category V area as well. And nothing within zone 1, impact absorbent and slip base within zone 2, and probably only concretes in zone 3. Similar thing over here. This is indicating here, down here, that zone 3 is actually, or zone 2 to zone 3 is actually 9 metres. They're expecting 9 metres clearance. When you've got 20 metre road reserve, that's not going to happen. So you're typically forced into impact absorbent and slip base as a mandatory requirement, and once again nothing within zone 1, which is your 1.5 metres offset from the actual shoulder, which in this case could be curved, and then or shoulder which is uncurved. These are actually exclusion zones, just hatched up in various intersection situations. Basically, your large hatch is your zone 1 exclusion areas. And as I was talking before there, you can see on that median on the far right hand side there, there's a minimum 6 metre setback from the nose of that splitter island. Similar thing on those turn type triangular shaped islands. You don't normally have lighting in there, but you could You may, if it's at an intersection where there's poles and wires, you may well end up with a pole sitting in there, like a rigid pole or a traffic signal pole sitting in there. Yeah, I'll move on with that. Category lighting submission should include a lantern spacing table, which details the specific lantern, the mounting height, the carriageway width, median, the overhang, which is the bracket length less the setback, upcast angle, a maintenance factor of 0.7, and a pole and lantern orientation, which, depending on the type of roads and whether you've got single side lighting or whether you're going to do staggered lighting either side, or if it's a median strip, you're going to have lighting along the median strip. You require a curved spacing chart if it's on a curved road, where applicable. Large radius bends don't require a curved spacing chart. I think it's anything greater than 500 metre radius doesn't actually require a curved spacing chart. Normal straight line calculations are adequate. Pole and lantern lighting contour plans, which shows adequate lightings at key locations, which is going back to those areas before where we were talking about 7.5 lux is required in certain areas, or a minimum of 7.5 lux. And in this case, 3.75 lux over the road verge, which is that 50% requirement on the lead up to that particular, on the road verge or nature strip up to the road carriageway itself. Lantern mounting heights, typically 10 metres for a standard output lantern, 70 watt to 105 watt LED. Typically 12.5 metres mounting height for a medium output, which is your 150 to 175 watt LED, and 12.5 to 15 metres for a high output lantern. And these are basically replacement respectively for your 150 sodiums, which is your orange light, which you still see around in a lot of older areas, or not so much older, probably anything more than probably 6 or 8 years ago, 6 or 8 years old, will probably still have LED high pressure sodium lanterns. So your 150s, your 250s and your 400s, these LEDs are a direct replacement for those. And your brackets are typically 3 metres or 4.5 metre single or double spigot. And for median strip applications, you might have 1.5, 4.5 asymmetrical doubles, where you've actually, particularly where you've got a turn lane, so your lantern is no longer in the middle of the road. It basically gives you the ability to try and keep your lanterns in a uniform line along the road. If you need to move the pole sideways, use an asymmetrical bracket, try and get your lanterns as close as practical to be in line with the rest of the road. Down the bottom there, you've got a curved spacing chart. Radius of curvature there stated 496. Your straight line spacing of 60 metres. And in the central median, it's then stating that you need to bring your lantern spacing back to 54 metres, which is down there, it's in your central median. So you need to probably be mindful that when you're looking at a design on a curve, less than 500 metres, have they included this curve table. In this case here, this is from PLE VCAT, which is a program that comes with Perfect Light for Windows, a complementary, it's like an add-on to that software. In a straight line, if you're doing a luminance-based design for a straight road, this will give you your typical lantern spacings based on the particular lantern in question. So you load up the CIE file, which is your photometric data, into the program, and you also then set the parameters for the use of that particular lantern. You've got LED light source, 5-degree upcast angle, 12.5 metre mount height, luminous flux output is 30.19 kilolumens. The arrangement of the lanterns is a dual central, so you get dual carriageway, a central median, and median width of 6.6. Lighting category is V3, and then you can actually set it to various road widths, various, in this case, spacings, but also various carriageway widths. So you've got a carriageway of 12 metres, carriageway width of 12.5 metres. You might do this if you've got a road which has got a number of intersections, a number of turn lanes being created. So you might say, well, all right, on the straight section I can get away with a lantern spacing of 65 metres. If you exceed your limits, it will actually come up with a no. Lighting contour diagram. You've got 3.75 lux contour, which is this blue one. You've also got a green one here, which is a 7.5 lux. In this case here, you've got intersection. You want to try and keep that. It actually sneaks out here a little bit. And I've possibly subsequently adjusted that because I have made a few revisions to this since this contour was done. But to get this contour outside the actual carriageway and this intersection where you've got turn lanes, it's a matter of positioning the lanterns and then running the program with the photometric data, gathering up the light source information from here. In this case, you've got central median with double spigots, and then single spigot lanterns here, and here. And because you've got splitter islands and medians, we basically use that full category V3 with a luminance-based design to cover this intersection area. That basically is demonstrating that meets V3 lighting design by virtue of the fact that it has adequate lighting throughout that intersection and all those key areas within the intersection. Looking at plans that are submitted, you will typically see this sort of thing, which is your typical service arrangement. In this case here, we had sort of guardrails in the median, and we also needed an offset from the guardrail, but also we needed an offset from the of the electrical cabling within that median strip so that it can get past the pole, but not be too close to the footings of the guardrail, just in the event that the guardrail fails, you've got a truck go through it. In this case here, I still think that pole is still at risk. It still needs to be a slip base because the deflection, acceptable deflection of that guardrail will still allow that truck to plough into the pole. It will be probably greatly reducing its speed, but it still needs to be an impact absorbent or a slip base pole in this case. And then just a couple of section diagrams, and then this here is just a table of individual poles and the lanterns and the brackets and the relevant standards on each particular pole. That's typically your, if you've got a standalone lantern arrangement and you've got, it's basically just got bracket lantern information and then an electrical schematic indicating where the power's coming from and where the lanterns are, what size cabling is running between the lanterns, where it's conduited and direct buried. Standard lanterns for use in category V areas. You also have, I'm nearly at the end here, so last couple of slides. In the case of, this is a pretty important one because I have seen situations where Powercorp and the supply authorities have actually missed picking up clearance of new lights to existing power lines. And you have a dynamic clearance for slip-based poles and for impact absorbent poles. See down here, you've got impact absorbent pole, dynamic clearance is 0.6 of the mounting height. So if you've got a mounting height of 12.5, you've got to have around about 7.5 metres physical separation between the pole and the nearest conductor. But that nearest conductor is not static clearance on a still day. It's actually maximum sag of that conductor and maximum sway with a stiff wind blowing it sideways. So you also got to allow for sag and sway. And typically that's something that lighting designers will miss. And it would be good if you as engineers can be just at least ask the question, does this meet the dynamic clearance requirements? I've actually found examples recently where Powercor themselves built a power line next to an existing lighting scheme, and lo and behold, they actually built the power line within these dynamic clearance zones, and no one's asked the question. It was only when I went and actually looked at it to look at a lighting design upgrade that I realised that it didn't comply. So it's good to have this information in your forum, so at least you've got an opportunity to be aware of it and perhaps at least ask the question. Check, because that's clearance below the power line as well as to the side of the power line, because the impact absorbent poles are designed to basically fold as the car runs over it, but then they'll whip sideways or whip forward as the car runs further over it or truck runs further over it. Slip post poles, on the other hand, are designed to just fly off at the base, and then they'll potentially, depending on how hard hit, they could career horizontally across the ground and then lay flat on the ground. And you just don't know whether or not that's going to move horizontally, depending on how high the vehicle is that hits it. That's an important design aspect. And in this case, consideration for erection of the poles. If you've got overhead power lines and your contractor's designed to have lighting installed in the vicinity of power lines, you need to consider the no-go zone and make sure that they can actually physically erect those poles within and comply to this no-go zone requirement. And bear in mind that typically your crane is, the jib of your crane is going to be about 1 metre to 1.5 metres above the top of the pole. So when they're standing that pole, you've got not only the height of the pole, but another 1.5 metres, and then you've got to try and maintain a minimum 3 metres clearance. In a lot of cases, it can't be done with power lines, street lights underneath power lines. It's really only category P areas where you would actually potentially get away with it. But even then, there are certain circumstances where even then you've got to arrange for Powercor to actually, or the supply authority to actually stand that light themselves. And that is it. So I hope that is giving you an oversight of the sort of design parameters that you may be looking for when you're looking at a public lighting plan. Yeah, and by all means, go and dig up the Australian standards and work your way through those.
Thanks, David. I don't know about you, but I've realised that I haven't been checking the street lighting plans anywhere near enough. I'd like you all to put your hands together and thank David for his presentation.